This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Jenny Ifft, K-State Agriculture Policy Specialist, begins today's show as she continues sharing information about the Farm Bill. She discusses the time period during the Eisenhower administration. Continuing the show is K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist Justin Waggoner on early weaning calves. He reviews the things that producers need to keep in mind to have successful calf growth. Finishing the show is K-State Dairy Specialist Mike Brouk, as he suggests easing cash flow issues this summer by deferring costs until later in the year when milk prices are expected to be higher. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and on this Tuesday, we continue our Farm Bill conversation with Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft. Jenny, thanks for joining us once again.
Great to be here.
We're going to kind of talk about the conversation after the Great Depression and what things look like leading into the Farm Bill, but a few things that are important to kind of set base with before we start the conversation: parity and technological advancements.
So, during the Great Depression, you had a lot of upheaval in society, a lot of suffering. There was a shift in the role of government in providing a safety net, both for hungry people and for farms and farm families. How they did this was with two policy levers: supply management, restricting production, and helping farmers have higher incomes through higher prices. How they did that was through a concept called parity. And it's a little tricky, but how it gets explained a lot is that if a bushel of wheat bought a pair of overalls in 1914, it should buy a pair of overalls today. That the purchasing power of the commodity of farmers producing should be based on this period, this golden age of agriculture, 1910 to 1914. So that was the general concept. And one of the challenges that came with implementing this policy, there were some production restrictions at the time, but farmers were taking advantage of advancements in technology. So, this could have been seed varieties. This could have been, moving from horses to tractors. There was all kinds of technological developments that were happening at the time. Yields were going up. Farmers were becoming more productive. And so you had those higher prices set at parity, and farmers responded by producing more, and they had the tools to do so.
Was technology kind of part in that as tractors maybe became more noticeable on fields?
Farmers were responding to the economic signals that they were provided. Here's the parity price, here's the price you're offered. And then they had these better technologies as well that they were taking advantage of. And what that ended up doing, depending, on what else was happening in the world and the economy, is creating periodic surpluses in which, because of the large role, the government had these large surpluses that they had to manage.
And so post-World War II, did they kind of see what problem the excessive surplus was creating?
This was definitely well understood. Now, going into World War II, there were high surpluses. The situation flipped. You had a war, you had high demand for commodities, you had the war effort, the government was encouraging production, farm support was high, consumers were rationed. Even at that time, there was an understanding of this problem of surpluses. And so there was, generally from the USDA, from government, from individuals, this understanding that if you set these support prices too high with the intention of helping farmers, you could end up with this untenable, difficult situation of surpluses.
And continuing to talk about farmers, 1949 we have the Farm Bill, which is the Farm Bill we go back to if nothing gets done for this year.
Yeah. 1949 is the permanent Farm Bill. And I think, to us today, and if we think about parity prices, it feels a little, I guess, crazy that if we go back to 1949, you're going to have to be paying prices based on parity. So from a strictly legal perspective, the USDA might have to offer $20 per bushel for wheat, corn, doubling, tripling the prices. Again, the sentiment, well, it's going to help farm families. But if that were the law, you'd have production in places where it's not really economically or environmentally feasible. So nobody wants to go back to 1949 today. But 1949 Farm Bill at the time was a reform farm bill, because what it did is it allowed the Secretary of Ag to charge 75 to 92% of that parity price. So if the Secretary of Ag saw that surpluses were building up, looking at sort of the economical and political at markets, at that political environment, if surpluses were building up, they could lower the support prices. So they had that flexibility to try to manage these surpluses. Not to say that was an easy thing to do, but it did give that flexibility to try to address this problem that people understood at the time.
In talking about surplus, going into the Korean War, did things start to ramp back up and we see another surplus?
The approach to the Korean War was similar to that of World War II. There's a war, demand is going to go up, we need to increase production, so prices were set closer to that higher level of parity. Now, what ended up happening was the Korean War ended after a couple years more quickly than expected. Production was high, so you had a lot of surpluses coming out of the Korean War.
Eisenhower, a president from Kansas,
yes,
a big portion of some programs he did, the Soil Bank and Food for Peace.
Eisenhower was elected right around that time. The Korean War had ended. You had large surpluses, and so his perspective and that of his Secretary of Agriculture. Now, his Secretary of Agriculture has been quoted as being a zealous economic libertarian and against the New Deal farm programs. And so their perspective was they wanted the market to have more of a role in setting prices. They didn't want there to be these high parity prices. They were concerned about the surpluses. So that was sort of the perspective of the Eisenhower administration going into the start of his time in office.
And something you mentioned for this, you referred to as the Secretary of Ag and Eisenhower sticking to their guns.
That period has been described as trench warfare in Congress. A lot of times we think political gridlock is sort of a new concept. And, during the 50s, when you look at the Farm Bill debates, there was definitely political gridlock. And you have what I like to call Team Corn and Team Cotton. This is a bit of a generalization, but you can think of Team Corn as the Midwestern interests. And they wanted prices to be closer to what would be the free market level. They wanted more flexibility in production. Team Cotton, you could think of those as more southern crops, cotton, peanuts, rice. They wanted to maintain those really high support prices. And this was a regional issue. It wasn't just based on political parties at the time, really based on what commodities were produced there and what policies were most advantageous to those commodities. So you had those two groups that just, had trouble coming up with any compromise. I do want to take a step back. So, wheat was predominant at Kansas at that time. And so in terms of the wheat production interest, sometimes they would side with cotton and sometimes corn. During this time, they were more on the side of cotton, but flexible as well.
So I mentioned when we started the conversation about Eisenhower, the Soil Bank, which is something that it continues today, just has a little bit of a different name.
Yeah. So a lot of the programs that came out of the Eisenhower administration were really in response to the surplus of crops that they had on hand. So how can we increase demand for crops we're producing in the U.S. or sort of decrease our supply? And one of the answers to this was the Soil Bank. The Soil Bank wasn't just about addressing the surplus. It also had environmental objectives. But this was paying farms to take land, especially environmentally sensitive land, out of production. Today, in retrospect, this is largely considered a land retirement program. So it was sort of relatively marginal farmland that maybe in previous decades the farm family had been able to eke a living out of. But at that time it was getting hard. So there was a lot of environmentally sensitive land, sort of not very productive economically either, that was coming out of production at that time. There was a lot of criticism of the program. I think for the producers that benefited from it, they were probably happy. But if you look at the press at the time, I think, one of the headlines was a $700 million failure. This idea that you were not giving out the payments very effectively, that farms were taking their least productive land out of production, so it wasn't actually affecting the surplus. So it wasn't terribly popular, and it was sort of phased out after the Eisenhower administration, but came back in 1985 as a conservation reserve program, which is considered very successful at reducing erosion and other areas. So the idea didn't go away.
Jenny, another program that Eisenhower worked with was the Food for Peace.
Yeah, PL 480, or Food for Peace as it's popularly known. Again, this one was partially in response to the surpluses, other policy objectives as well. And this one would have been diplomacy. And the idea behind Food for Peace was, we have a lot of surplus production in the U.S. and you have hungry people all over the world. So how can we get some of our surplus to these places where people need food? General idea was shipping U.S. commodities to places where it was in need and either giving it to countries or selling it at a very low price to these countries to address hunger. And that program still exists today. Definitely impactful for the people that are benefiting from it, but not a huge share of commodity production in the U.S. today.
And Jenny, to wrap up this time frame of talking towards the end of the Great Depression to the Eisenhower administration, in a short summary, what was it like?
Well, I think if you go back that broader trend that you were seeing, we talked about this huge increase in the technology, the tools that producers had, whether it was pesticides, seeds, tractors, huge increase in yields. You also had a lot of families moving off the farm at that time. Just a huge change in society, not just in agriculture. And today, I think when a family has to leave the farm, that's painful. And it was probably, painful to some degree. But a lot of this, where families were moving off this farm, that happened at a pretty rapid rate from the Depression to early 1970s, was for economic opportunity, whether in, rural towns or in urban areas. But a lot of it was for this economic opportunity, this economic growth that was happening throughout the country.
Jenny, thank you for coming on and continuing our path forward as we look at the history before where we're at the Farm Bill now. I appreciate it.
No problem.
That was K-State Extension Ag Policy Specialist and Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and a topic that we wanted to talk about was early weaning calves. And then to talk about that, we have K-State Extension Beef Cattle Specialist in Garden City, Justin Waggoner. Justin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you.
So early weaning calves, why are we thinking about doing this year?
Normally we tend to think about early weaning calves most often in a drought scenario. And really with that, we're looking at, really reducing our grazing pressure by removing those calves from the pasture, but also lowering the maintenance energy requirements associated with lactation on those dams and in the cow herd. And so that's one of the primary reasons that we often think about early weaning. However, I would also contend that it can be a great management strategy, especially for younger females in the herd. We certainly know that following those first calf cows, that can be a really challenging time for those cows to maintain body conditions. And so maybe looking at implementing an early weaning scenario as a management practice on those younger females can also be a great way to allow those cows to pick up some additional condition, because really that's what we're after, is improving that cow condition by removing that calf and that additional energy associated with lactation. So it's our hopes that we can get those cows to pick up a little bit of body condition score by removing that calf. Our research at K-State would really indicate that in 45 to 60 days, if we wean that calf essentially 45 to 60 days early, we can pick up about a half a condition score on those cows and then maintain that condition score on through the winter months and all the way to subsequent calving in some situations.
A lot of different reasons there to maybe go ahead and wean those calves early. And you mentioned 45 to 60 days. Is that 45 to 60 days earlier than what producers usually do?
In terms of early weaning, if we think about a traditional weaned calf is going to be 180 to 220 days of age, so 6 to 7 months of age, if you will. And so typically an early weaned calf would be any calf that's weaned, by my definition, less than 180 days of age. And so for all means and practical purposes, an age that works really well is about 100 to 150 days of age. If we look at an average of a 120-day-old calf, that's what I would consider to be a typical early weaned calf in most management systems. So that's really what we mean by an early weaned calf. However, that can fit many, many different definitions. Oftentimes the question comes up, well, how early can you wean a calf, right? What's the other end of the spectrum? And so the literature would indicate that we can wean those calves. They've got all the metabolic machinery, rumen function is in place by 45 days of age in most cases in those calves that have been developed under a normal production scenario. So we can certainly implement an early weaning protocol very early, but for success in terms of, most commercial type cow-calf enterprises, an age of around 100 to 150 days of age typically works very well.
If producers are thinking about early weaning calves and maybe this is their first year, they're still in their beginning phases, what are some things that producers need to remember?
One of the biggest things I think for a producer that has not done early weaning before is just simply getting accustomed to the fact of, we're going to be weaning a much lighter weight calf than what we typically would. So these are going to be 350 to 450 pound calves, so fairly lightweight calves. And so we need to keep in mind that our nutrition and management programs certainly need to change to go along with that. So if you will, oftentimes in terms of dry matter intake, those calves are not going to consume a large amount of feed. Typically upon weaning, we're looking at dry matter intake somewhere in the neighborhood of 1% of body weight. And so that calf, initially after weaning may only be consuming, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 5 pounds of dry feed per day. So that's really not a lot of feed. And so it's going to take a fairly nutrient dense diet for those calves to be able to maintain acceptable levels of performance. And so just mostly due to the fact that, they just don't have that capacity to eat a lot of feed yet. Now, as we get through the program, obviously our goal is to bring those calves up on feed. And so they can perform very well. That's often one of the other misconceptions that are out there on these lightweight calves and these early wean calves is that, they may have some performance limitations. And, really if we manage the nutrition program quite well and we can get ad lib intakes up there in the neighborhood of 2.2 to 2.5% of body weight, we can see average daily gains in excess of 2 pounds per head per day. And oftentimes these calves will convert very well. It's not uncommon to see feed conversions in a dry lot scenario where these calves are going to be converting 4 and 5 to 1. So very, very good in terms of the feed efficiencies. And most of that's just due to where they're at in their growth curve. Those young calves are growing very rapidly, and so we can capitalize on that.
Do producers need to consider what their facilities look like?
So there are some facility considerations that we certainly need to keep in mind. I mean, most of our facilities are designed for much larger calves. If we think of dry lots and feed bunks and water tanks and the height of all of those things, typically we're used to having some larger animals in there, especially if it's set up for 600 to 700 pound calves. So, oftentimes making some additional considerations for both the height of the feed bunks as well as the water tank, and probably more importantly, having some management. Oftentimes near those water tanks, we get some holes, we get some soil that's been removed over time. It's really a good idea to come in and do some pen maintenance and just make sure all of those things have kind of been filled in, mostly so that those smaller calves can get up to the bunk and reach that water tank, and having some additional considerations there. The other things that we can do is sometimes we can go in and we have a fairly large pen that we intend to wean those calves into. We can take some panels and maybe make that pen a bit smaller, keep those calves a little closer to the bunk, if you will. That can be another great management strategy that also can serve to reduce the dust in those pens. So we want to make sure we get in there, clean those pens, and kind of have them prepared for those calves to come into.
And do you see any more health concerns when you do wean the calves early?
That's one of the other misconceptions that's out there is that, oftentimes we think of these lightweight calves, or we often think of, well, we're going to have some health challenges with these calves. And, in our research that we've been involved with here at K-State at the Ag Research Center at Hayes, several studies looking at preconditioning duration as well as early weaning protocols, what we've observed collectively, if you will, just as a broad summation of some of those studies, is that our health risk in our early wean calves is very comparable to our conventional wean calves. Now, obviously, there's a big piece of management that goes along with that, and getting the nutrition right, getting those calves to consume dry feed, and also having a really good herd health program in place can go a long ways towards getting those calves off and starting right. But our experience has been with the early wean calves, if they're managed appropriately, we really don't see any more health risk in those calves than what we would expect in our traditional wean calves. Anytime we wean a calf, regardless of whether it's at 250 days of age or 120 days of age, that's obviously a stressor to that calf in terms of that maternal separation. And so does that increase our chances of maybe having some health challenges? Absolutely. But when we do make that comparison with those early wean calves, we certainly don't see, or at least we have not observed in our work, any increases in the health challenges associated with those calves.
So overall, if the calves are managed well, even a few years down the line, you can't tell that they were early weaned calves.
We think about, just the weaning phase in general. Really what we're trying to do is set those calves up for the next phase of the industry, if that's going to a feedlot or even a grazing scenario. And so that has been our experience. If those early weaned calves are managed appropriately, we can really do a good job of managing the health as well as the performance on those calves as well.
What are a few key points then for producers if they're still kind of weighing their options? What are some of those benefits, but then also maybe some concerns with early weaned calves?
So, if you think of some of the biggest benefits of early weaning calves, I really think is that improvement in cow condition. That, especially the value of cow condition. In a drought scenario, maintaining body conditions on those cows is very important, especially if we think about we never know what we're going to get in terms of the next season to come, right? Regardless of whether that's in a spring calving cow herd or as well as a fall calving cow herd. So anytime we have some environmental challenges there where we feel like some body condition score may be lacking on those cows that have cows aside, early weaning can be a great way for us to help those cows out. I think the other thing on these calves is that those feed conversions, in terms of efficiencies in an animal that we are looking at weaning and putting on feed, yes, there are some additional costs associated with that, but theirs is a very efficient animal if we manage the nutrition appropriately. The other thing that is an advantage on these early weaned calves is if we think of many of the value-added programs that are out there for marketing calves in terms of preconditioning programs. These calves that have been backgrounded 30 to 45 days, if we've, managed the health program, we've given them their shot, so to speak, they're going to fit many of those value-added marketing programs that producers might have that opportunity to take advantage of just by simply that nature of they have been preconditioned and backgrounded to some extent. We've also got that additional weight gain on those calves as well. Some of the cons, if you will, of early weaning would be just the management associated with weaning, those lighter weight calves. There is a certain degree of labor associated with that management program. We still have that regardless of whether it's an early weaned or a conventional weaned calf. But there are just some additional things that we need to pay closer attention to in terms of both our facilities or our nutrition program. And the other side is, what's our labor situation look like if we were to pull the trigger and wean those calves 30 to 45 days earlier than what we normally would? There are some concerns there, right? We certainly do have to have those facilities to do that. But by and large, it is a management practice that works very, very well and does have that, additional added benefit of allowing that cow to put some additional condition back on, especially late in the grazing season.
That was K-State Extension beef cattle specialist in Garden City, Justin Waggoner. There's an article and a webinar which can be found on ksubeef.org, and we will link to that in our show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Dairy production typically drops off during the summer, and with low milk prices and relatively high feed costs, producers may be facing a cash flow issue. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk discusses some options for deferring some costs to a later date.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning some of the issues we have ongoing as we look at margins on the dairy farm. As we enter into the summer months, we're going to experience lower dairy production in terms of milk production in our herds in most cases. A lot of times as we think about summertime milk production, we'll see it slide maybe 5-10 pounds per cow per day. Pretty significant drop when you couple that with the fact that we're also experiencing some much lower than normal milk prices on our dairy farms this summer as well. So when you look at the cash flow, it's going to be rather tight. Increasing the pressure on your dairy farm is also the fact that our feed prices remain relatively high. As we look to the future into the fall, we may see some reduction in those prices and a little bit of relief there, but for the next several months, we're going to have some issues with margins on our farm. So what are some things that you might be wanting to think about as you look at your farm and as you look at cash flow for the next 3 to 4 months? Well, we never like to talk about deferring maintenance, but sometimes that is something that we need to think about on our farms. So there may be certain maintenance things that can be deferred for a short period of time to try to switch those expenses to the fall rather than during the summer. As we look at our forage needs, again, we want to make sure that we purchase enough forage to make it through the winter, but we may want to hold off on some of those purchases until a little bit later in the year, or defer some of that cost to a little bit later in the year when we expect that there will be a little bit higher milk price. Now, as you look at your herd and you look at productivity, it's probably a good time to now consider at what point do we actually need to pull animals out of the herd in terms of milk production, because they're simply not paying their cost of feed as well as the variable cost of being in the milking herd. Coal prices right now are fairly high, so if you do have animals in your herd that are at lower level of milk production and below your break-even, it's important to move those out of the herd as quickly as possible. It will give you some increased cash flow because of the sale of cull animals, but it will also reduce your expenses going forward on an animal that is still not breaking even in your herd. Some other things you might look at is you might look at your heifer supply and decide whether or not you have some extra heifers that need to be marketed. If that is the case, summertime might be a good time to do that, again, to shore up your cash flow just a little bit. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to take a look at some ways that they can increase cash flow during the summer months.
Thanks, Mike. And before we close out today's program, Rod Bain reports on USDA conducting testing to determine if additional verification methods are needed for companies wishing to use negative antibiotic claims for cattle.
It is one of the proposals offered by USDA regarding the substantiation of animal-raised claims in cattle, increased verification of what is called negative antibiotic claims. As Deputy Undersecretary for Food Safety Sandra Eskin explains,
raised without antibiotics, no antibiotics ever, etc. There was a study done last year and published in the journal Science that tested animals, tested cattle, destined for the raised without antibiotics market, and in fact, they found antibiotics in their systems.
So USDA, through its Food Safety and Inspection Service and Agricultural Research Service, will conduct testing to determine if similar results occur. If so, some options for consideration include documentation of test results by companies with periodic monitoring, or using USDA's testing as the basis for a negative antibiotic verification program. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.